Welcome to Sage and Fettle Ayurveda. I'm Angelina, and today we're going to be discussing how to make your own ghee. So ghee is a wonderful substitute for butter. It is the oil of butter. So what we're basically doing is clarifying the butter. We're eliminating the milk solids, the lactose, the casein. Generally, all that stuff gets worked out. We're also getting rid of all of the moisture from water and things like that. So we end up with just the oil from the milk. So it goes from milk to yogurt to butter and then into the ghee. So in order to make your own ghee, you'll need a pan. Today I'm going to be using, this is 1.5 quarts. So depending on how much ghee you're making will determine on how big of a pan you're making. And then you want to make sure you don't use a burner that has too much heat. So you wouldn't want to put your pan on one of your boiling burners, one of the larger burners. You'll need 8 ounces of butter. So I like to get grass-fed organic butter, but it's totally up to you what kind of butter you want to get. The important thing is that the butter is not salted. That's the key. No salt butter, unsalted. It's generally a good idea to let this become room temperature before you start. However, if for some reason you forget or it doesn't work out that way and you need to, you can just cut it into chunks, which I did for you today, just so you can see. So the other things that you'll need, I like to have a plate with a paper towel on it. There's a period where we'll scrape off some of the foam and froth from the ghee, and so I like to put that on here and then discard it. And you'll need a spoon. You can use a slatted spoon if you like. I just like to use a regular stainless steel soup spoon. It just works for me, but if you'd like to use a stainless or a slatted spoon, that's totally up to you. I like to have just a cup or a small plate or something to put my spoon in so I don't get the butter all over my counter. You'll also need a strainer. And if you don't have a strainer, you can use cheesecloth instead, or you can use both. I like to use both. I cut my cheesecloth into about a square that fits right inside of my strainer. You can certainly use a bigger strainer than this. This just happens to be the one that I have. And then I like to also use a 4-cup glass measuring cup. So it's important because we're using hot liquids to use glass, and preferably one with a handle. If for some reason you don't have one with a handle, always make sure that you use oven mitts or pot holders to make sure you don't touch anything that's hot with your hands so you don't get burned. And then the last thing that you'll need is an 8-ounce container. So you can just use a mason jar or any other kind of jar that has a lid. The important thing is that it has a sealable lid and that you have sanitized it before you put your ghee in it. So that's a big thing, to make sure that all of your equipment that you're using is clean and dry before you start, because you don't want to contaminate your ghee. Okay, so to get started, we'll just add the butter into the pan. A little bit warm there, and then turn it on to roughly medium low. It doesn't have to be too low or too high, just to kind of get it started. And you can see it's already starting to melt a little bit. So I did cut mine into little chunks, so I'm going to break it up here so that it'll melt just a little bit faster, since it was not brought to room temperature before we started. Okay, so we'll give this a little bit of time to melt. So the first step is to just melt your ghee. So just melt your butter, okay? And you want it to melt completely. So you'll have the heat at about medium low just to get the butter melted. And then once the butter is melted, we're going to turn it down to low and let it come to a little bit of a simmer. So it's going to bubble just a little bit. And then we'll have to keep an eye on it. So making ghee is a very simple process, but it's a process that takes quite a bit of time and a lot of patience. So if you're making 8 ounces of ghee, depending on the size of your pan and the heat that you're working with, it's going to take anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, just depending on what you're doing. So if you're making more ghee, it'll take a little bit longer. If you're using a larger pan, it might go a little faster with a less amount of ghee because you'll have more surface area. So it kind of just depends. If you're using a larger pan with only 8 ounces of butter, you really want to keep an eye on it so that you don't burn it. It's really easy to burn it when the liquid is not as tall in the pan. So you really want to make sure that you keep an eye on it. So this is not a process that you can set it and forget it. You do have to constantly be at the stove, keeping an eye on it and making sure that it's going the way that it should, because you don't want to burn the ghee. That being said, if you do burn your ghee, you can still use it. So still put it in your jar, and you'll just want to make sure that you keep it in the refrigerator if you burn it. You won't want to use it on things like toast or as a topping, but you can use it to still saute things. It won't really affect the taste so much, but it won't really be as delicious if you put it on as a topping. So don't worry, you can still use it, but just use it for sauteing. Don't use it really as a condiment. Okay, so mine's starting to melt pretty good. I still have some little chunks in there. Okay, and you will have to give it a constant stir. Kind of at the point right now where we're still just melting, so it's okay to scrape the bottom. Once we get further into the process, we're going to want to make sure that we aren't scraping the bottom of the pan with the spoon, because the milk solids will solidify to the bottom and we don't want to stir those up. We want to let them stay in the bottom of the pan. Okay. So you can see that there's starting to be this white foam forming on the top of the liquid. So this is something we're going to eventually scrape off, but we want to let as much of it as possible boil off on its own naturally, so that we don't scoop out any of the good stuff. So you can see mine is starting to bubble around the edges just a bit. So I'm going to let it warm up on this medium-low temperature just a little bit more. And then when it gets a little bit more bubbly, I'm going to turn it down to low heat. Okay. So again, this is something you really need to keep an eye on. It's pretty nuanced, so you want to practice and just know that it's going to happen that you're going to burn your ghee. It's just part of the learning process for this. There's a very small window where it goes from perfect to burn. And so you can see mine is starting to bubble quite a bit now. So I'm going to reduce my heat to low so that I can keep the bubbles just a little bit below a simmer. Don't want it to bubble too much, but just enough. All right. So while that's boiling, or while that's simmering, there's a point where the ghee is perfect and then will burn. And so it's really important to have all of your items that you're using ready to go. Sometimes for me, what I found is when I burn my ghee the most is if I let it sit in the pan too long between the process of removing it from the heat and actually getting into the jar. So getting it from the heat immediately is really important, and then getting it from the pan into the jar is also really important so that it doesn't continue to cook. So again, something you have to keep an eye on, and it takes a lot of practice to really see that point and know when it's right. Okay, so you can see mine is still starting to get a little bit of froth. So this process of getting the froth is going to take roughly about 5 to 10 minutes. Again, depends on your pan and the heat of your stove. So I'm going to recommend that you pause the video here and come back in roughly 5 minutes. So what you're going to want to look for is that the froth is going to start to congeal together, and you're going to start to be able to see through to the liquid a little bit through the froth. So it's going to start to make little like round clumps and start to stick to the edges just a bit. So go ahead and pause your video, and we'll see you in roughly about 5 minutes. Welcome back. So it's been roughly about 5 minutes. We can see here in the pan that this foam is starting to collect together in little bits. And you can see that it's starting to separate a little. So the milk solids are starting to separate away from the oil and the liquid. So once we let this go just a little bit longer, we can start to scrape some of this stuff off of the top. Okay, so this is what you're looking for when you're ready to scrape. So I'm going to give this just a little bit of a scrape around the edge. And this is, again, where you may choose to use a slotted spoon. You'll want to really make sure that you have this on a good temperature that's low enough that the liquid isn't going to bubble up and burn your hand. And you also want to make sure that it's low enough that the steam is not going to burn your hand. Okay? Again, you really want to be careful. So if it would be better for you to use a oven mitt on your spoon so that you don't accidentally touch your hot pan, you are always encouraged to do what you feel safest doing. So you don't want to scrape off too much. So again, we don't want to scrape the bottom of the pan. So when you do this, it really isn't just going into the pan. It's literally just kind of scooping it over slightly from the surface and just getting little bits at a time. So this is, again, a little bit of a tedious process. Where it's simple, but it just takes a lot of patience and some time. So when you're doing this scraping process, you want to make sure you don't scoop up any of the liquid, right? So you can see here I've got a lot of the yummy stuff that we want to leave behind. So again, you always want to kind of just work from the surface as best you can. So I've kind of got to the point where if I do much more scraping, I'm going to scoop up some of the good stuff. I'm going to just do one last little scrape. Put that over on my towel so you can see I don't have a ton, right? So don't need a lot, just getting the big chunks off. So if you do scrape off too much, you're going to end up with quite a bit less ghee. So you should end up with roughly a whole full 8-ounce jar of the liquid of ghee. If you don't, it means you scraped off too much. And that's fine. You know, it's all a learning process. So you might do it the first couple of times, and then you'll kind of get used to it. Okay. So you can see here, I've got most of that scraped off. There's still some in here. I'm going to let it continue to simmer at this sort of slow bubble here. So again, I'm going to suggest that if you are watching this while you're cooking, that you take a few moments to pause the video and come back in about 5 minutes. So what you're going to look for is it's going to start to separate to the point where you can begin to see the bottom of the pan just a little bit. And you're going to start to see more bubbles starting to form rather than the sort of thick white coating. You're going to start to see more like bubbles as if it was bubbling up from the bottom, kind of like how it is now. But it'll be a little bit easier to see. It'll be just a little bit clearer. So I will see you in about 5-10 minutes. All right, welcome back. So you can see here in my pan, you can begin to see toward the bottom, my foam is starting to dissipate a little bit. I do have a little bit still there, and you can see the kind of like bubbles starting to form. So you don't have to worry about scraping off too much more. But you can see it's starting to have this nice golden liquid, sort of clear texture. Yeah. And that's really what we're going for. So if it starts to turn more of an amber color, that's when you know it's about to burn. So you can, you'll want to make sure that you turn off the heat immediately, even if you still have some of the bubbles and things like that. It'd be better to kind of get it done too soon than let it burn. If for some reason it gets to the point where it's not quite clear all the way and you have to take it off just so that you don't burn it, you may decide that you want to store your ghee in the refrigerator just in case. If you're able to get it to the point where you just have the oil from the ghee, you can store your ghee in the jar in a dark place, just like a kitchen cabinet, and it'll last about 8 months to a year, depending on how long it's in there, but just use it just like you would butter. If you're worried about contamination, you can always keep it in the refrigerator. Okay, so I'm going to give my... So again, you want to always make sure that you're just kind of stirring the surface and that you're not getting into the bottom to stir up any of those milk solids. So I'm going to give mine just another little scrape there. Get some of these off. I like to just kind of scrape up the side just in case, kind of let some of the liquid so that I only get the solids out of there and not take any of the good stuff. So now we're just starting to see those little bubbles mentioning. And this is, again, just more of the water is starting to boil off. Okay. So how would you know if your ghee is contaminated? Well, you'll know if it gets moldy and then you'll have to throw it away. But in order to prevent it from getting contaminated, you always want to make sure that you use a clean utensil. So if you were using a knife to butter toast, you would want to use the knife in the ghee and then put it on the plate and then use another knife to butter the toast. If you use the same knife, you dip it into the ghee, you butter the toast, you don't want to put that knife back into the ghee because you will contaminate it. So same thing, you don't want to rinse the knife off. If you get water into the ghee, it's going to contaminate it. So you always want to use a fresh, dry, clean utensil. If you're going to use multiple things, you can just leave a spoon in the jar. You always want to make sure that it's covered and sealed in between uses. But if you have a couple people in the household and you're using it for a meal, you can just leave a spoon in the jar and everybody can just use that. But again, you want to make sure you don't get oil. So always use a clean, dry utensil. Okay. So you can see it's starting to get a little bit clearer. More of the water is starting to bubble off. So we want to do our best not to have to scrape any of this off because, again, this is just the liquid. It's less of the solids. So we want to let this evaporate off as best we can. So just kind of giving it an occasional little stir. And you should have it still on low. So it's not going to be bubbling quite as much at this point, and that's fine. That's kind of what we want. Okay. So if at some point, you feel like you're like, I'm not sure if it's done yet or not, err on the side of I'm not sure that it's done so that you don't burn it. If you still have some of these bubbles and things in here, that's okay. When you pour it through the strainer or the cheesecloth, it's going to take care of some of that. And you can do a double strain if you have those bubbles. So you can go through the strainer twice, which is perfectly fine. There's no reason you can't do that. Okay. Just kind of giving it an occasional little stir. All right. So what we're going to look for next is the bubbles are going to start to evaporate off a little bit more. We're going to make sure that it's nice and clear at the bottom and that the milk solids are starting to kind of solidify at the bottom. So this might also be a good place for you to pause the video and come back in about 5 minutes. Welcome back. So it's been roughly 5-10 minutes or so. You can see here in my pot that it's starting to be much easier to see to the bottom of the pan. It's getting clearer and clearer, which is wonderful. I still have some of the white foam coming up from the moisture evaporating, but we're kind of starting to see this darker amber color starting to form. Maybe you can see it there. You can see that the milk solids are starting to brown into the bottom. So I think I'm getting to the point where I may need to take this off, even though I still have some of this foam here on the outside. So one way you can tell is to kind of just scoop a little out. I still have a pretty good golden color here with the ghee, so I'm going to let it go for just a few more minutes, a minute or two, just to make sure, again, it doesn't burn. All right, so you can see my foam. I just scooped a little bit off, but you can see most of it is collected around the edges. I don't have much boiling going on anymore, so I'm kind of teetering again on that edge of burning it. So it's pretty clear. You can see to the bottom, so I'm gonna turn my burner off. I'm gonna move this stuff out of the way. So again, it's important that you get it off of the heat fairly quickly so that if you are on that edge, that it doesn't burn. So again, I like to put mine in the measuring cup just to give myself a little extra time if I need it, so I don't feel as rushed. So I'm going to just put this here, so hopefully you can see it. And my pans are not great for pouring, so for me it's just a little bit safer this way. I'm also going to use a pot holder here just so that I make sure I don't burn myself. So I'm going to pour it over the cheesecloth, through the strainer, and into the measuring cup. So the strainer, again, will catch most of that extra little bubbling. It might not get all of it, and that's fine. All right, let's give it one last little pour. I don't want to leave any of the good stuff behind. right, so here you can see, right, like I have a bunch of the milk solids are browned into the bottom, so this pan will have to soak with warm water and soap before you can clean it. So we'll put it over here to cool off. You can see I got a few of the milk solids in my strainer there, but not too many. Most of them stuck to the bottom. So I did get a little bit of the liquid into my ghee here, into this container. So this is another reason why straining it into the measuring cup is a good idea, because now I can double strain it into the jar. So it's really important, if you're going to touch the containers when the liquid is warm, that you use something to protect your hands, again, like a pot holder or an oven mitt. Okay, so I'm going to get myself set up here. I have my ghee and my jar. I'm going to put my jar here, get my strainer, and I'm going to hold my strainer over my jar. And you do have to do this when it's still liquid. So if you'd like to let it cool just a little bit before you work with it, that's great, but you need to make sure that it's still liquid, or you're going to have a really hard time getting it from the pan and then from here into your jar. So just giving it a little double strain there before I do so, just so that you can kind of see, right? It's mostly clear. You can see pretty well through it. It's a nice gold and yellow color. So I'm going to just double strain this into my jar. And then, just because I don't want to waste any, I'm going to use my spoon, and I'm going to smush my strainer just to get all the liquid out that I can. Again, I'm using the spoon because it's still kind of warm and I don't want to burn myself. Okay, and here we are. Let's see. It's a comfortable temperature. It's okay for me to touch it. So you always want to make sure it's not going to burn you, all right? All right, so you can see we have a lovely golden, nice, very clear ghee here. And I did pretty good. I almost got my full 8 ounces. And so if you are using the mason jars with the lids that are separate like this, I like to put my lid on right away while the ghee is still warm and screw it on as tight as I can, and then let it cool for a little while. And then I come back and check on it, and sometimes the lid gets a little loose, so I tighten the lid again. And then by the time the ghee fully cools down, it will have sealed itself, which is a really great way to make sure it seals without actually having to do the whole canning process, which is really nice. So just so that you can see the difference, the first time I made this video, I did burn the ghee because I wasn't paying attention as I was making it. So the one here in my right hand is burned. You can see it's a nice amber color, and the one here on my left is perfect. So I can still use this burned one. I'll just keep it in the refrigerator, and I can just use it for sauteing and things like that. So if it turns like a dark brown color or, really gnarly looking color, you are probably going to want to discard it. But if you end up with something that's kind of this amber color, you can still use it. So that's totally fine. So I hope this was a helpful tutorial for you, helping you feel a little bit more comfortable making the ghee on your own, and just remembering that this is a process. It takes time, it takes practice to get good at it, and it is easy to burn. So you really want to make sure that you can keep a good eye on it as best you can. So I hope you enjoy your ghee, and I look forward to seeing you again here at Sage and Fettle Ayurveda.